Alright, hello once again, Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College. And I've been going over the PowerPoint presentations for Murox, JavaScript, and jQuery 3rd edition. This is part of the AWD Application and Web Development 1000 Web Technologies class. And I am in the middle of Chapter 17 of 18 of the book. And I'm about to go into how to create a factory function. Let me just preface this by saying that, in my humble opinion, object-oriented programming is difficult to learn. Let's just say it's difficult maybe to master. All right? It takes a lot of practice. What makes this even tougher is JavaScript handles object-oriented programming differently than most every other language that I know and have ever used. All right? So, we just learned that you can use the constructor function to create multiple instances of an object, but there's another way that you can do it. Constructor functions in JavaScript let you create an object type and customize its prototype. They provide a familiar syntax to programmers working with other languages. So they look very similar, but in the background at least it's a little bit different, sometimes a lot different. But JavaScript isn't a classical language. Some programmers wanted another way to create new objects. So to address this, a few years ago when ECMA 5, version 5 came out of JavaScript, they added a new create method to the object type. Now the table that you see at the top of page 519 shows this. This is the syntax of the create method. The first parameter that gets provided is the prototype object that you want to use for the new object. The second parameter is an optional object that describes the properties that the new object should have. Now, this may not work correctly in earlier versions, so the author chose not to use it in this chapter. Okay? This example that you see right here, setting it up like this, is the same as doing this. You're creating basically an empty object. All right? Usually, though, you'll use the create object with a custom type of object, and that's what's shown here. This last example shows how to use the create method in what's called a factory function. A factory function is, what it does is it creates, it initializes, and it returns objects all in one swoop, so to speak. They're similar to constructor functions in that you can add properties to an object and initialize these properties with the values passed into the function, but you don't need to use the new keyword. Because of that, the name of a factory function shouldn't start with a capital letter. All right, it should basically hold similar to a standard JavaScript variable. Also, a factory function must specifically return the object that the function creates. The code that follows the factory function here shows how it can be used. Again, this is fairly complex stuff. So they go back and they recreate the library.trips file using a factory function. All right, the trip library file contains a getTrip function, which is the factory function. Like the earlier constructor function, this one accepts 3 parameters we saw before. But unlike the earlier one, this function does not use the this keyword to refer to the new object the function will create. Rather, a new object named trip prototype is created. All right? It's created with the methods that the objects returned by the function will use. Then the trip prototype object is passed to the object create method up on top here, as you can see. The main JavaScript file itself really isn't very different. The only real difference is in the event handler for the trip function. It creates a new trip object by calling the getTrip factory function rather than the trip constructor function, and it doesn't use the new keyword. So there isn't all that much difference between using a constructor function and using a factory function. By and large, it's kind of at least a matter of personal preference. All right. So next, what the author does is talks about some more advanced skills. Yeah, that's just what you think. Maybe that's just what I needed was more advanced skills for working with objects. Now, when you call a function in JavaScript, the arguments are stored in the parameter list of the function. All right, this is similar to other programming languages. What sets JavaScript apart, though, is that the parameters are also stored as in the arguments property of the function object. So the arguments property is similar to an array. Okay, within this property, each of the arguments passed to the function are stored in an element starting with index. So you can access these elements by using their indexes. However, the arguments property isn't a true array object, so you can't use the typical properties and methods of an array. But the good news is there's a way around this that we sort of talked about before. So the first example that you see here, that's on the top of page 523, shows how to use the arguments property to access an argument that's passed to a function. In this case, the element at index 0 is the arguments property used in the expression that returns true if that argument is divisible by 2 with no remainder. In other words, if it's an even number. The second example that's here shows how to use the length property of the arguments property to determine if the correct number of arguments were passed into a function. The third example shows how to use the arguments property to create a function that can receive a variable number of arguments. The fourth example shows how to use the arguments property to create a function with optional parameters. And finally, the fifth example shows how the third and fourth examples can actually be used in practice. Next, what's discussed are what are referred to as cascading methods. And a cascading method is a method of an object that can be chained with other methods. All right. Sometimes this is known as fluent coding because of the way it reads and the way it, for lack of better words, it kind of flows. Looks very similar to what we looked at earlier with jQuery. So a method must return the object represented by the this keyword if it's going to be chained with other methods. It's also possible to inherit methods from another object. When you create objects, you can inherit methods from other objects. This allows you to create a base object with common methods and then extend it. So this is the equivalent, basically, of inheritance in JavaScript. So the first set of examples that you see right here show how to inherit methods with constructors. First, the code creates a constructor named %, with a property named rate. Then it adds a single method named getPercent to the prototype. Next, the code creates another constructor named commission with the properties named rate and isSplit. The code adds a calculate commission method to the prototype. The rate property has to be defined again in the commission constructor, even though it's defined in the % constructor, because it isn't defined in the % prototype, so it's not automatically inherited. And then the last example here shows how to use the commission constructor. Again, as mentioned, pretty heavy stuff. One thing that we've been using in here, but kind of skirting around it for lack of better words, is the use of the this keyword. The this keyword is what's referred to as being contextual. So in other words, the value of it depends on how the particular function is invoked. As it says here, if it's a normal function call, this is undefined in strict mode, and if you're in non-strict mode, it's a Windows object, the window object. If you are using a method of an object, the this keyword refers to the object that contains that function. And if you're using an event handler, the this keyword represents the object that raised the event. In other words, the button that was clicked, as an example. The methods of a function for specifying the this value, there's 3 of them. The call lets you, as it says on page 529, lets you specify the value of this at the time you invoke a function. Parameters other than this are coded individually. The apply lets you specify the value of this at the time you invoke a function, but the parameters rather, other than this are coded as an array rather than being coded individually. And the bind lets you specify the value of this when you code or assign a function. The parameters other than this are loaded individually. So all functions have a this keyword, but the value depends on how the function is invoked. What the call and the apply methods do is they can be used to effectively borrow methods from another object. The bind method, on the other hand, can be used to assign a method to an object as an event handler. Then the value of this can't be changed when the event is raised. So we go back again to our old familiar task list application that we've worked on in a couple previous chapters. So the last eight pages of this chapter discuss this. This is, again, another version of the application we worked on in earlier chapters. This version has a due date as well as a task name. And it adds links to allow the user to delete individual tasks once they've been completed, so that the idea is that the task list won't get too big. All right, on page 531, they show some of the HTML here. Note that the script elements in the head section identify the libraries that are used. The HTML in the main section contains a div with an ID attribute of tasks. The individual tasks are added directly to the div element in JavaScript code. There's also a second div element with a class of clear. The HTML that is shown here, and this is just a portion of the HTML, shows the style rules for the div element with the tasks of ID and clear. The task and storage libraries are shown on pages 532 and 533. The library task, library_task.js file is the library for working with individual tasks. The task list library is shown on pages 534 and 535. This is the library for working with a task list. It holds an object named task list, and that object holds, edits, and displays tasks. As only one instance of this object is needed, it's coded as an object literal that has 2 properties and 7 different methods. If we look at a couple of these, the load method that you see right here calls the retrieve tasks method to retrieve the tasks from local storage as an array of task objects. The sort method calls the sort method of the tasks array. The delete method accepts an index parameter. It'll remove the task at the specified index by using the splice method of that array. The clear function calls the clear method of the storage object to remove the string in local storage. The last method that's here is the display method, which accepts a div element as a parameter. It starts by calling the sort method to sort the task, and then it loops through and constructs a string, and so it can print out all of the tasks in the task list. Finally, on 536 and 537, we've got the main JavaScript file. This starts with the jQuery ready function, which attaches event handlers for the click events of the add task and clear task buttons. It also activates the jQuery UI date picker. and displays the task list and sets the focus on the text box. The ready function that's in here and the event handlers call the different methods of the task list object. That's pretty much it. All right, which leaves us only with one more chapter to go in here, and that last chapter, chapter 18, another very complex chapter, is on how to create and use closures, IIFEs, which are actually known as IFEs. All right, we'll talk about the module pattern and plugins, and I will be back to go over that particular chapter, the last one in our text, shortly.